A Boy Called Poe, Autism in the Movies. A presentation by Lauren Carpenter, Casey Donohoe, and Kelsey Shanklin.
All right, so we decided to do our group presentation on the movie A Boy Called Poe. It's a 2016 film that we found on Netflix. And the film has an interesting plot line. So, when David Wilson's young wife falls victim to cancer, he's left a single working dad with the sole responsibility of caring for his sixth grade son with autism. Patrick, who prefers to be called Poe, is a gifted but challenged child who is very close to his mother and unable to communicate his own sense of loss. As father and son struggle to deal with life after mom, they each begin to withdraw into their own worlds. So David's in a high-pressure job, and he's close to losing Poe, who's drifting away from the school where he's bullied. And Poe goes into this magical fantasy world, which is called the Land of Color, where he's just a typical carefree boy with a rich cast of other fun companions, like a pirate and other fun people. The growing divide between dad and son and the challenges of single parenthood of a special needs child threaten to separate David and Poe permanently. This film is actually based on a true story, and the bonds of love between a grieving father and son are tested in the most real way in A Boy Called Poe.
I'm quite concerned about Poe's declining situation.
What's wrong with you, freak?
He has autism. My son won't give me a hug, but that doesn't mean I love him any less.
In the article, Mental Health on Screen, a DSM-5 dissection of portrayals of autism spectrum disorders in film and TV, Nordahl Hansen et al. Analyzed 23 recent films that included characters on the autism spectrum. The researchers found that the portrayals were very stereotypical, often including at least 9 out of 12 diagnostic characteristics and a special talent, i.e., the ability to analyze numbers or remember medical information. Although these representations align nearly perfectly with the DSM-5 diagnostic manual, in real life, there is a far greater diversity in individuals on the autism spectrum. The CDC reports that about 1 in 59 children identify on the autism spectrum. Nordahl Hansen et al. Report that only about 1 in 3 individuals on the autism spectrum have a special talent that is so often portrayed in the media. This narrow representation causes stereotypes to be reinforced within society and may even contribute to the treatment of individuals on the autism spectrum within the systems. After receiving an ASD diagnosis for her youngest son, author Sarah Bradley spoke out about the media representation of autism, stating, "Autism isn't any one thing. Not all bad or good, not all joy or devastation, not all giftedness or impairment. It's called a spectrum for a reason. It possesses a million different shades of itself."
A Boy Called Poe unfortunately follows the historical trend with the film's portrayal of characters of autism. When assessing Poe using the DSM-4 diagnostic classifications for autism spectrum disorder, Poe meets 11 out of the 12 requirements. In addition, the audience learns that Poe has an extraordinary ability to read and invest in the stock market, making hundreds of thousands of dollars without his father even knowing. This can be classified as the stereotypical role of an autistic person in film and television to possess an unnatural talent or habit. Poe also demonstrates severe social deficits within school and his life at home. The only character we see Poe really connect with is a young girl who ends up being imaginary, showing that Poe can only genuinely interact with figments of his imagination. This movie does have an additional representation of autism in the character of Jack. Jack is the janitor at Poe's school and displays some characteristics of autism spectrum disorder as well. Jack also plays a large role in Poe's daydream, often portrayed as the hero or ideal of what Poe would like to be. It is fairly disheartening to see that the only adult with autism in this film is placed in a low-valued position and is hardly recognized. However, despite the somewhat stereotypical nature of Poe's character, we agree that the film addresses several very real barriers that individuals with autism spectrum disorder and their families face. There are many systems at play in Poe's story. The main systems are the medical industrial complex, the MIC, and the education system. Different systems interact with one another multiple times throughout this film, including the personal systems and beliefs of the director of the film. The director, John Asher, has an autistic son and used his personal experience to create a framework for the film, including the multiple systems that interact. The overarching macro systems of ideologies and ideas of what autism is trickles onto the exo, meso, and micro systems. When society, as a whole, believes certain things on a macro level, it tends to affect all systems levels. Because of this view, Poe is outcasted at school, which affects him on the microsystem level based on the attitudes from a macro perception. From the opening scene, we see David attending the funeral of his wife, without Poe, his son, in tow. Poe's father doesn't bring his son to his own mother's funeral, which could show that he doesn't think Poe has the capability or capacity to understand grief and loss. The social worker perpetuates this stereotype by insinuating that David, now a single father, cannot raise Poe. The social worker stresses Poe needs continual care and decides to institutionalize him without really understanding Poe and his autism. We see the mixed system, school system, and social service system interact here to remove Poe from his father's care. As a parent in systems theory, it is impossible to separate the different levels of systems. They are all intertwined, which is seen in Poe's interactions among school, peers, family, social services, and attitudes of all these systems.
So Poe clearly has a lot of systems at play in his care. The medical industrial complex is one huge system that Poe interfaces with quite frequently. Three of the main points of the medical industrial complex and what Poe experiences will be discussed on this slide. So under institutionalization, Poe was sent to an institution specializing in children with autism. So the school system, quote unquote, advocated for Poe to go to the institution because they felt his current supports weren't enough to help him and that he was being bullied a lot. The institution that Poe went to was seen as structured, rigid, and honestly quite sterile. The institution furthered Poe's daydreaming and disconnection with his external world. Poe's father then visited him and noticed his disconnection and actually took him out of the institution. Another system at play are the insurance companies. So Poe's father, he ended up being in a really high-stress situation, both fueled by his job and by taking care of Poe, and he ended up losing his job. Because he lost his job, he and Poe were no longer covered on his employee-sponsored health insurance. Poe's dad actually took the incident up with his occupational therapy clinic's financial service manager. And Poe's dad was told he could purchase another plan, but it would cost more than out-of-pocket insurance would. So really expensive. He could petition that coverage, but it would take 18 months to complete the petition, and the insurance was only good for 12 months. When he brought up these systems issues with the insurance companies and the way that this is structured, the financial services woman told him that she's figured that out and she knows that, but she can't do anything about it. Lastly is the disability services and programs. So tying both of those together, insurance companies are able to choose which services are necessary and which are considered optional. Poe's occupational therapy was deemed optional, even though Poe's father and the occupational therapist strongly advocated that it significantly helped with Poe's autism.
Since the implementation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1975, the diagnostic criteria for the spectrum of disabilities has greatly increased. However, the education systems are unable to, and sometimes unwilling, to meet these greater demands. At the time of this act passing in 1975, the CDC reported 1 in 10,000 children being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. That statistic has increased dramatically, with the department now reporting 1 in 68 children. In combination with the rapid increase of ASD diagnoses, the lack of a proper definition and standards for appropriate education has caused many obstacles for children with autism and their families. Many are forced to develop and seek out education plans outside of the traditional education system, causing considerable financial burden and time commitment. A study published by the journal Pediatrics recently reported that a child diagnosed with ASD will cost an average of $17,000 more in health and child care costs than a child that does not have ASD, with over $8,000 of that going to educational expenses. Public schools are increasingly placing students with disabilities into special education classes, separating them from the regular students. The separation makes it more difficult for students with ASD to build relationships with other students and often doesn't meet educational needs. To combat this issue, schools are supposed to provide vouchers to reduce the out-of-pocket educational expenses if a need cannot be met within the traditional school setting. These vouchers are often difficult to attain, do not fully cover the cost of an alternative treatment, or may not even be used due to the lack of available services in the community.
All right, who is making the decisions? So the Colorado Cross Disabilities Coalition's mission is nothing about me without me. This phrase has not been honored in the story of Poe. The social work values of dignity and worth of a person would mirror this phrase best, the nothing about me without me phrase. Poe's voice wasn't heard in any of the major decisions that directly impacted his life. He wasn't treated as though he had dignity and worth by his family and his team because they assumed he had no opinion or didn't know what was going on in his world. They basically assumed that they could make the decisions because Poe was incapable of making those, because he was disconnected from his world. The people on this slide are the individuals and the systems involved with that process. Second, honoring the social work values of social justice, Poe and his father were unable to advocate for their insurance's decisions on whether or not occupational therapy was a necessary service. Having a voice regarding the services that directly impact Poe would have been helpful for their family's stress. And that would have avoided a lot of further issues that they went through that could have been avoided potentially by that stress. So mainly Poe's voice and choice and being heard would have been so helpful for this process, for his progress and his engagement.
Think of it. A disability is usually defined in terms of what's missing, but autism is as much about what is abundant as what is missing, an overexpression of the very traits that make our species unique. Always unique, totally intelligent, sometimes mysterious.
So here are just a couple questions we have for the class. Are we forcing individuals with autism to conform to communication styles that we find comfortable instead of learning how to understand theirs? As social workers, are we consistently including individuals with disabilities in decision-making processes? And how can we change the current system to create more support for individuals with autism and their families? Just a few things to think about. Thank you so much for watching our presentation. Here are our references, and have a great rest of your day.
So don't say that I'm in the dark, 'cause you can't